There's a thin line between faith and pride. David Coleman thought he knew the difference. For 12 years, he was certain he stood on the right side of that line. David was pastor of a small Baptist church in Cedar Falls, Iowa. It wasn't one of those mega churches with giant screens and worship bands. It was the kind of place where you knew every person sitting in the worn wooden pews. 50 members on good Sundays. 30-something when the snow got heavy. He'd been a hardware store manager for 15 years before answering the call to ministry. Good salary, benefits, retirement plan. But at 42, during a Wednesday night service, something shifted inside him. It wasn't dramatic. There was no audible voice from heaven. Just a quiet, unshakable certainty that his place was behind that pulpit. Sarah, his wife, supported the decision without hesitation. She always had that way of looking at him and saying, "If this is what God is showing you, then this is where we need to be." They had 5 kids at the time. Michael was 12, Emma, 10, the twins Joshua and Caleb, 7, and little Grace was only 4. The church couldn't afford a full salary. It never could. Monthly offerings barely covered the building expenses and Sunday school materials. What was left over got divided. A tiny portion for David, the rest for missions. $900 a month, sometimes less. Sarah started making cakes and pies to sell at the local farmers market on Saturdays. David picked up some carpentry work here and there, but he made himself a promise, and a promise to God. He would never let money dictate his ministry. If God had called him, God would provide. The first Christmas was hard, but manageable. Sarah managed to buy a few simple gifts at the department store clearance. The kids got 1 toy each and seemed genuinely happy. David preached on the 25th about baby Jesus being born in a manger with nothing but swaddling clothes and his parents' love. The irony wasn't lost on him. But by September of the second year, the hardware store where David had worked shut its doors. Carpentry jobs started drying up. Cedar Falls' economy was in freefall. Church offerings dwindled. Some families moved to bigger cities looking for work. The Colemans found themselves living exclusively on the $900 a month. That Christmas, there was no margin for gifts. Sarah cried in the kitchen while she prepared a simple dinner of roasted chicken. The kids asked about the tree. David sat with them in the living room, the lit fireplace being their only decoration. "Kids," he said, his voice steady but gentle, "you know what the greatest Christmas gift is?" "Jesus," Emma answered automatically, the way Sunday school kids do. "Exactly. And if Jesus is the greatest gift, everything else is just wrapping paper, isn't it?" Sarah started teaching the kids to sing, "Jesus is the greatest gift," every Christmas Eve. It became tradition. They'd gather in the living room, sometimes with just candles lit to save electricity, and sing. David would read from the Gospel of Luke. They'd pray, and then they'd go to bed. No tree, no presents, no special meal, just faith. But faith has a way of being tested to its limits. 3rd year, 4th, 5th. Michael entered high school. He started coming home quiet after school. One day, Sarah found him sitting in the backyard just staring at nothing. "What's wrong, honey?" "Nothing, Mom." "Michael." He sighed. "Tyler got an Xbox. Jake got a new iPhone. Everyone was showing off at lunch what they're getting for Christmas." Sarah sat beside him on the cold grass. "And you?" "I said we don't celebrate Christmas, that it's a commercial holiday." "That's not true." "I know." He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that broke her heart. It wasn't anger. It was something worse. It was resigned acceptance. But it's easier than explaining. Emma, always the peacemaker, tried to make the younger siblings understand. "Dad is serving God," she'd say. "That's more important than toys." But when she herself was 15 and all her friends were posting pictures of Christmas parties in their decorated homes, Sarah caught her staring at her phone screen with tears streaming down her face. "Are you okay, sweetie?" Emma wiped the tears quickly. "Yeah, Mom, it's silly." "What's silly?" "I just wish, just once, I could have a Christmas picture like everyone else." She turned off the phone. "But it's okay. Jesus is the greatest gift, right?" The phrase had become a mantra, but Sarah was beginning to wonder if it had also become an excuse. In the 6th year, something happened that would silently change the dynamic. Martha Henderson, one of the church's oldest members, showed up at the parsonage on a Tuesday afternoon. She was in her early 70s, widowed, and rarely missed a service. She carried a basket covered with a dish towel. "Pastor David," she said when he opened the door, "I made an extra apple pie yesterday and thought your family might enjoy it." David smiled warmly. "How thoughtful, Sister Martha. Sarah will love this." Martha didn't move. She looked at him with those piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through people. "Pastor, may I speak frankly with you?" "Of course. The congregation has been talking. We know things are tight. Several of us have wanted to, we wanted to help in a more substantial way, especially with Christmas coming." David felt something harden inside him. "Martha, I really appreciate the concern. It's not concern, Pastor. It's Christian love. And I receive that love. But God has been providing for us faithfully. We don't need charity." The word came out sharper than he intended. Martha blinked. "Charity? Martha, I didn't mean—" David took a breath. "What I mean is, God called me to serve this church. If he called me, he'll sustain me. I can't preach about trusting God and then reach out asking for help. That would send the wrong message. Wrong message to whom? To the church? To my children? To myself?" Martha was silent for a moment. Then she nodded slowly, placed the pie in his hands, and turned to leave. "Pastor David," she said without looking back, "sometimes God provides through people. Maybe the test isn't whether you'll accept help. Maybe the test is whether you'll let others be blessed by blessing you." The door closed behind her. David stood there, holding the pie, feeling something he couldn't name. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't regret. It was something closer to defensiveness. He'd made the right choice. He was sure of it. 7th Christmas, 8th, 9th. The years bled into each other, each one marked by the same quiet absence. While other families filled their living rooms with torn wrapping paper and laughter, the Colemans gathered around the unlit fireplace and sang about Jesus being the greatest gift. The kids had stopped complaining. That somehow was worse. Michael, now 21, had gotten a partial scholarship to community college. He worked 40 hours a week at a grocery store to cover the rest. He rarely came to church now. When Sarah asked, he'd say, "I have to work, Mom." But she knew. She saw it in his eyes. Emma was a senior in high school. She still came to services, still sang in the choir, still smiled. But there was a quietness in her that wasn't there before, like a part of her had learned to shut off. The twins, Joshua and Caleb, now 17, had developed a kind of dark humor about the situation. "At least we don't have to write thank you notes to anyone," Caleb joked one day. Joshua laughed, but it was a hollow sound. Only Grace, now 14, still seemed genuinely at peace with everything. She was the one who always started the Christmas song. She was the one who prayed for the church's needs with a faith so pure it broke Sarah's heart. But even Grace had her moments. In the 10th year, Sarah found her writing something in her journal. When Grace realized she was being watched, she quickly closed the notebook. "What were you writing, honey?" Grace hesitated. "Just a list." What kind of list?" "A list of things I wish I could give you and Dad." Sarah sat on the bed next to her. "Gracie, it's not about me, Mom. I swear, I really don't care about gifts. But I just wish I could buy you that coat you keep looking at in the window. And Dad those new glasses because I know his are broken but he pretends they're fine." Sarah pulled her daughter into a tight hug, fighting back tears. David didn't know about Grace's list. He didn't know about Emma's tears. He didn't know Michael had stopped believing. Not really. He was too busy trying to keep his own faith intact. Because the truth was, David Coleman was beginning to crack. He didn't admit it to anyone, not even to himself most of the time. But there were moments, late at night, when he should have been preparing Sunday's sermon but was instead staring at bills they couldn't pay. When he wondered, had he heard God right? Had he confused his own will with divine will? Had he sacrificed his family on an altar of pride disguised as faith? In the 11th year, something broke. It was Christmas Eve. The family was gathered as always, preparing to sing. But when David started reading Luke chapter 2, his voice failed. "And it came to pass in those days." He stopped. The words blurred. His vision swam. "David?" Sarah's voice was distant. He looked at his family. Sarah, who had given up so many dreams to stand beside him. Michael, who would probably never come back to church. Emma, who had learned to bury her emotions so deep he feared she'd never find them again. Joshua and Caleb, who made jokes because it hurt less than admitting disappointment. And Grace. Grace, who still believed, but who wrote lists of gifts she could never give. "I can't," he whispered. "Dad." Emma moved closer. "I can't do this again. I can't pretend this is right." Sarah knelt in front of him. "David, look at me." He looked. There were tears in her eyes, but also something else. Strength. "You're not pretending. You never pretended. You believed. We believed. But look at them, Sarah. Look what I've done to them. You haven't done anything to them. You loved them. You served God. I was proud." The words came out like a confession. "Martha tried to tell me. The whole church tried. But I thought I knew better. I thought accepting help meant weakness. I thought..." He couldn't finish. Grace moved then. She sat on the floor at his feet and took his hand. "Dad," she said softly, "you taught us that Jesus is the greatest gift. And you're right. But you know what else you taught us?" He shook his head, unable to speak. "You taught us that God provides. You've said it 1,000 times. God provides. And He always has, Dad. Always. It might not have been the way we wanted. It might not have been easy. But we're here. Together. Loving each other. Loving God. That's provision." Something inside David broke completely in that moment. It wasn't destruction. It was rupture. Like when a seed's shell cracks so something new can grow. They sang that night. But it was different. It was more real. Less like a statement of strength and more like a plea for grace. David prayed. But for the first time in years, his prayer wasn't, "Thank you for sustaining me in my faithfulness." It was, "God, I don't know what I'm doing. Help me." Nobody expected anything to change. It was 5:30 in the morning on Christmas Day of the 12th year. Cedar Falls was covered in a blanket of fresh snow that made everything look clean and new. The sun hadn't risen yet. David woke to a sound. Knocking at the door. He got out of bed, confused. Who would be visiting at this hour? When he opened the door, nobody was there. But on the porch, there was a box. It wasn't a regular cardboard box. It was made of wood, carefully constructed, about 5 feet long and 3 feet wide, heavy. And carved into the lid, simple but unmistakable, was a cross. "Sarah," David called. She appeared in her bathrobe, eyes still heavy with sleep. "What?" "I don't know." One by one, the kids came downstairs. Michael, who had come home just for Christmas Eve and was planning to leave that morning. Emma, Caleb, Joshua, Grace. They all gathered on the porch in the dim dawn light, staring at the mysterious box. "Is there a card?" Emma asked. David looked. There was nothing. No name, no note. Just the cross. "Let's open it," Grace whispered. With trembling hands, David lifted the lid. What was inside took everyone's breath away. Money. Neat stacks of money. David picked up one of the envelopes. Inside there was a handwritten note. Living expenses, $15,000. But that wasn't all. There were gifts, carefully wrapped, each with a name. For Michael, professional carpentry tools and a card from a local construction company offering an apprenticeship. For Emma, a professional paint set and canvases. She had mentioned once, years ago, that she'd love to paint, but never had money for supplies. For Joshua and Caleb, complete camping gear and vouchers for a youth leadership program at a Christian conference. For Grace, an acoustic guitar with a note. Every voice that praises needs an instrument. For Sarah, that coat. The coat from the window display that Grace had written about in her list. For David, new glasses and a leather study Bible with his name engraved. And food. Boxes and boxes of food. Everything for a complete Christmas dinner and another month's worth of groceries. At the bottom of the box, there was a letter. David picked it up with shaking hands and read aloud. "From the one Jesus healed through your prayers." That was all it said. Sarah collapsed, sinking to the porch floor, her hands covering her face, sobs shaking her entire body. Emma knelt beside her, also crying. Grace grabbed her father, burying her face in his chest. Michael stood there completely still, staring at the tools in his hands. Silent tears ran down his face. 12 years, he whispered. 12 years, and someone was paying attention the whole time. David couldn't speak. He just held Grace and stared at the box. This impossible, inexplicable, and perfectly timed provision. They carried everything inside, sat in the living room, surrounded by more blessings than they could process, and did the only thing they knew how to do. They prayed. But this time, it wasn't their usual prayer. It was something completely different. David held his family's hands and his voice broke as he spoke. God, I spent 12 years trying to prove I could trust you without needing anyone. I thought that was faith, but I was wrong. Faith isn't refusing help. Faith is recognizing that all help comes from you, that every hand that reaches out is your hand. Thank you. Thank you for not giving up on us. Thank you for this angel who didn't dare reveal themselves. And thank you. Thank you for breaking me enough to finally see. They ate that day. A complete Christmas dinner. Turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, pumpkin pie. The kids opened their presents. Michael spent the entire morning trying out the tools. Emma set up her easel in the corner of the room. Grace played clumsy chords on her new guitar, laughing at the wrong notes. It was the most perfect Christmas they'd ever had. But the story didn't end there. David investigated. Of course he investigated. He asked every church member, subtly at first, then more directly. Nobody knew anything. Or if they did, they weren't saying. He even went to the police, thinking maybe there were security cameras somewhere that might have caught something. Nothing. Whoever had left that box had disappeared like smoke. Years passed. 3 years. 5 years. Life changed drastically for the Colemans. Michael used the tools to build a custom carpentry business. The apprenticeship led to a full-time job, and eventually he opened his own shop. He came back to church. Not immediately, but gradually. And when he did, it was with a deeper, more authentic faith than he'd had before. Emma went to art school. Her paintings started appearing in galleries. She painted scenes of faith, moments of common grace, beauty in broken places. Every painting seemed to glow with light from within. Joshua and Caleb became Christian camp counselors. They spent summers taking teenagers into the wilderness and sharing the gospel around campfires. They discovered that making others laugh could also make them reflect. Grace became the worship leader at church. Her guitar, that mysterious guitar, was at every service, leading the congregation in worship songs that made even the hardest hearts kneel. Sarah finally had her coat, but more than that, she had her family back. She saw her children thrive in ways she had prayed for but feared she'd never see. And David became a different kind of pastor. He preached with a different kind of authority now. Not the authority of someone who had all the answers, but the authority of someone who had been broken and reassembled by God's hands. He started teaching about humility, about receiving, about how pride can wear the clothes of faith and deceive even the most devout. The church grew, not because David changed his message, but because he changed himself. But the question remained, who had sent the box? The answer came 7 years later in the most unexpected way. Harold Mitchell had been a church member for decades, a quiet, shy man. He sat in the back row, rarely spoke, always left quickly after services. He'd worked as an accountant at a local firm before retiring. When Harold died at 83, his niece Linda came to organize his belongings. She showed up at the church door on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a cardboard box. "Pastor David," she said, "I found this in Uncle Harold's things. I think you should see it." It was a journal. David opened it with careful hands. The pages were filled with Harold's shaky handwriting, years of entries, prayers, reflections, and then an entry from 12 years ago, or rather a series of entries covering those 12 years. David read aloud to Linda, his voice getting weaker with each word. May year. Diagnosed with stage 4 stomach cancer. Doctors gave me 6 months. Don't know how to tell my church friends, I'm so afraid. June. Pastor David announced prayer requests on Sunday. He didn't know, but one of them was mine. A woman had called anonymously asking for prayers for someone with cancer who's too scared to ask for himself. It was my neighbor. She'd seen the hospital van in my driveway. The whole church prayed. Pastor David prayed with an intensity I'd never seen, like he was wrestling with God for my life. August. Went back to the doctor expecting to plan my goodbye. The tumor shrank, significantly. Doctors have no explanation. December. I'm in complete remission. A medical miracle, they say. I know better. Those prayers, that man's faith, God heard. David had to stop. His hands were shaking. January next year. Found out Pastor Coleman's family is struggling. Saw Michael wearing shoes with holes. Saw Emma declining school lunch. It breaks my heart. February. Gathered some money. Wanted to take it to them. But when I parked in front of the parsonage, I couldn't get out of the car. My shyness paralyzed me. Drove home feeling like a coward. December. Another Christmas with nothing for the Coleman children. Heard Grace singing on Christmas Eve about Jesus being the greatest gift. Her voice was so pure, but there was sadness in it too. Prayed for courage. The entries continued, year after year. Harold trying, failing, feeling guilty, saving money, planning. But his social anxiety always won. Until the final entry. December, 12 years after diagnosis. I'm 81 now. God gave me 12 extra years. 12 years I shouldn't have had. Each one was a gift I received because Pastor David asked God for a stranger. I can't wait for courage anymore. I have to create courage. I spent the last 3 months planning. Quietly figured out what each child needed. Linda helped me without knowing why. I built the box myself. Carved the cross because this is all because of him. Tomorrow morning at 5 a.m. I'm delivering it. I'll knock on the door and run before anyone sees me. My heart might not handle all the emotion, but I don't care. It's worth it. If I die doing this, I'll die happy. Finally, after 12 years, I'll have courage. There were no more entries after that. David closed the journal. Tears flowed freely down his face now. Harold, he whispered. Harold Mitchell. Linda wiped her own eyes. I didn't know. He never said anything. Just left instructions that if anything in this journal mentioned you, I should deliver it after he passed. David thought about Harold. Quiet Harold. Shy Harold. Who sat in the back row and escaped before anyone could talk to him. Who had been cured of terminal cancer through prayers offered by a pastor who didn't know who he was praying for. Who had spent 12 years fighting his own nature to find a way to give back. Who finally, in one single act of extraordinary courage, had changed everything. He lived another 5 years after that Christmas, Linda said softly. And you know what's funny? In those last 5 years, he was different. Lighter. He actually talked to people after church. Smiled more. It was like finally doing something had freed him to really live. David held the journal against his chest. Can I keep this? It was his. But I think he wanted you to have it. That Sunday, David preached about Harold. He read from the journal to the entire congregation. There wasn't a dry eye in the sanctuary. Harold Mitchell taught us something, David said, his voice resonating in the sacred space. He taught us that courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is loving despite fear. He taught us that the truest gift we can give is allowing ourselves to be instruments of God's provision, even when it costs us everything we have. He paused, looking at his family in the front row. But he also taught me something more personal. He taught me that pride can look like piety, that refusing help isn't the same as having faith, that sometimes letting someone bless you is the greatest faith of all, because it requires humility to acknowledge that you need. The congregation was completely silent. Harold wasn't just healing our family when he left that box. He was healing himself. He was completing a circle of grace that began when he was a scared man dying of cancer, and prayers from strangers reached heaven for him. David held the journal high. This is the gospel, people. It's not complicated. God heals us. We heal others. They heal more people. Circles and circles of grace extending forever. And all it requires is that we be willing to pray, willing to give, willing to receive. He looked directly at Michael, then at Emma, then at each of his children. Harold gave me 12 extra years with my children by forcing me to confront my pride. 12 Christmases of pain transformed into a lifetime of learning. And now, when my children have their own families, they'll know, not theoretically, but deeply, that God provides. Not always when we want, not always how we expect, but always, always, He provides. After the service, something incredible happened. People started sharing. Martha Henderson stood up. I was the one who called anonymously about Harold having cancer. I knew he'd never ask for himself. A man in the third row stood up. I was the hardware store manager. I always felt guilty about having to close. Seeing how you made it through, it changes how I see failure now. A young woman stood up. I'm Jake's daughter, the boy with the iPhone that made Michael feel bad. My dad went bankrupt 3 years later. We lost everything. But I remember when it happened. Michael showed up. He brought groceries. He didn't say anything about our situation, he just said, God provides. And I believed him because he had lived it. Story after story. Ripples of grace extending outward from a single act of timid faith. The church wasn't just a congregation anymore. It was a community of living testimony. All because one quiet man found courage. All because one proud pastor learned humility. All because one family refused to stop believing, even when believing hurt. David is 62 now. Michael is married with 2 kids. Emma exhibits internationally. The twins run a thriving youth ministry. Grace released her first worship album. And every year, on Christmas morning, the Coleman family gathers. They start with the tradition. They sing, Jesus is the greatest gift. But now after they sing, they add something. They open Harold's journal, kept in a special box Michael built, and read one entry aloud. A different one each year. And then, before they open any presents, they ask a question. Who is God calling us to be herald for this year? Because the final lesson wasn't about receiving. It was about passing it forward. Harold spent 12 years gathering courage to do one courageous thing. David spent 12 years learning humility through pride. The Coleman family spent 12 years discovering that provision isn't always about abundance. Sometimes it's about perseverance. But the real story, the one that keeps unfolding, is about how one single act of radical courage can reverberate through generations. How many people were touched by that box on the porch? How many lives were changed because Harold finally acted despite his fear? How many families were saved because Michael learned compassion through need? How many souls were reached through Emma's paintings or Grace's songs? The numbers are impossible to count, and that's the beauty of it. When we act in faith, real, humble, courageous faith, we never know the full reach. We never see the complete impact. We just plant the seed and trust God will water it. Harold never met the children Michael helped years later. He never saw Emma's paintings hanging in churches around the world. He never heard Grace singing to thousands at worship conferences. He never knew Josh and Caleb would lead hundreds of young people to Christ through their camps. He just knocked on the door and ran. But God saw, God knew, and God multiplied that act of obedience beyond anything Harold could have imagined. So if this story touched your heart, let it do more than warm your feelings. Let it ask this question: who is your herald? Who is God placing on your heart to bless, but you've been too afraid, too proud, or too doubtful to act? Because it might be that someone's next 12 years, or their next 12 minutes, depends on your courage to knock on the door and take the next step. God's provision is infinite, but He chooses to work through us. Be someone's herald today.